From studios at the Journal-Sentinel in downtown Milwaukee, this is Fourth and State. In this edition, Mark Reynolds wants you to pay a carbon tax to deal with climate change. Should you? How can he justify a new tax at this time? We'll ask him about that on Fourth and State. I'm David Haynes, opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and we're joined today by Mark Reynolds, who's executive director of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which has nearly 50 grassroots organizations in the United States and Canada. Its goal is to create the political muscle to back climate change legislation. Climate Change Lobby is behind a recent bill sponsored by California Congressman Pete Stark, which would tax coal, oil, and gas based on the amount of carbon dioxide that these fuels emit. Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
And why a carbon tax?
There's an economist named Pigou. He talked about Pigovian taxes, where he asserts that sometimes the market fails, in that the market doesn't really assess the true cost of something to society. I think if we looked at oil and we said, okay, we should include the cost, the real cost of oil in what we pay, then you have to add a couple of $1 trillion for our trips into Afghanistan and Iraq. If you take oil and you look at what happens to the degradation to the environmental and the economic viability of those communities, we're not including that cost. So there's a lot of economists over time who said this is the right approach to correct the market failure. Laffer from the Reagan administration, Mankey from the Bush administration, Shapiro from the Clinton administration, who say, first of all, you need to correct that market failure. But they also add the piece that we've been advocating, which is that you need to take the revenue from that and not use it to feed government, but rather to send it back to American households to help them make the transition while we make a change over to renewable energy.
And how would that work? Where would that revenue go in the ideal plan?
In the ideal plan, households would get a monthly check. And so you would take all the money. What we would do is start taxing at the source of the energy coming into the economy, at the oil well, at the coal mine. We've talked to the top legal experts in the world who say that a border adjustment for this would hold up. So if there were other countries that did not have the same type of tax, we could have a tariff and it would not be considered punitive by the WTO.
Now, how does that affect a manufacturing state such as Wisconsin, which uses a tremendous amount of energy to make stuff? And we have a number of jobs that are in those industries. Does that need to be taken into consideration for states like Wisconsin that maybe are more energy consumers than other states? Yeah,
that's one of the questions people ask, and also the other question that's commonly asked is, what about the states that are so heavily coal-based, as contrasted with, you take Washington State, where all their power comes from hydropower.
And Wisconsin would fit that category.
Yeah,
as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's been quite a bit of studies done to show that those regional impacts are not as significant as most people believe. The good thing is if you take all of the money and send it back to households as a monthly dividend check, 2/3 of American households will actually come out even or better, not only just in the increase in energy costs, but obviously manufacturing costs will go up, and they'll pass that through to their consumers. So we expect that in all cases, both the energy companies and the manufacturers will pass it through ultimately to consumers, but as long as the consumer's protected, then it shouldn't do anything to diminish their buying power, et cetera.
So why not cap and trade? Why a carbon tax as opposed to a cap and trade regime?
Well, the biggest problem with cap and trade is not, the cap part's always a good idea, right? Because we say we'll limit emissions. There's some difficulty that comes into play when you add the trading component that has the potential of causing energy costs to spike. If you can imagine energy futures, energy derivatives. But the biggest flaw in cap and trade is every time it's been proposed, they include offsets. And offsets are essentially a dishonest way of dealing with the issue. Now,
why is that?
Well, the offset projects themselves are always good. So they're usually things like planting trees, capturing methane. But how the offset provisions work in the legislation is they say you don't actually have to reduce their emissions. You can just agree that you'll go plant trees. Well, we want people to plant trees, but we can't pretend that that's really reducing emissions.
Right.
Exxon just got a huge credit for an offset project in Nigeria. And what they said they would do is they would stop burning the gas plumes there. Great. We don't want them to do that. But Nigeria's had a law since 1985 that makes that illegal. So we find that that's kind of the way the offset projects go.
Case, what have you gained?
Exactly, and it's pretending something's happening when it's not really happening. What we're told oftentimes by politicians is we can't get climate bills to pass without offsets because that's the way coal and oil will buy in.
Right.
Well, something about that seems incorrect to us.
And what kind of traction can you get with the carbon tax? Politically.
Politically, yeah. That's a really interesting question. So the question is, what do people say behind the door
Right.
that we don't get them
Sure.
to say in front of the door?
So what are they saying behind the door?
Behind the door, they say it makes complete sense to them.
Okay.
Only
They
if
meaning who?
Republican
Republicans?
office holders, members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives. I'll give you an interesting case, a very heavily coal state, Bob Corker of Tennessee.
Yep.
He said, his staff said, last year, that when Senator Cantwell introduced the CLEAR Act, which was a cap and dividend, that if she had gone to 100% revenue neutrality rather than 70%, he would have co-sponsored. So that would add another Republican on the legislation. Here's the reason that we think this should be attractive to Republican legislators. If we take all the money and we send it back to American households, one, many of them have signed pledges saying they won't vote for any legislation that increases government revenue.
Right.
So they can honor their pledge and still vote this way. Two is part of our approach is also...
Grover Norquist has signed off on that? Have you checked? Just wondering.
We do work to try and create deep partnerships with people in office.
Okay.
Some of the people who try and influence them we haven't worked so much on. But he should be able to sign off on it, given it is revenue neutral.
Okay.
But also, we are also saying that let's not subsidize energy at all. So if we eliminate energy subsidies, but we simply send a signal to the market saying that there is a predictable rise in the cost of energy, that will tell banks, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists where their price point, where they're guaranteed to make money. So we think that it's an easy sell to Republicans to say, we're going to solve this with the market. So rather than us picking winners and losers, rather than us subsidizing certain parts of the energy economy, us simply saying, okay, the market doesn't correctly assess the cost of coal and oil. We correct that with the tax, but by giving all the money back, we let American entrepreneurs solve it.
Let's shift gears for a minute. What's your take on the UN climate talks in Durban?
I don't even know why they try and have those talks. I can't imagine getting 180 people in a room and getting them to agree on anything. And there's so many competing interests that
And they haven't agreed on anything. As far
they
as I
haven't
know.
agreed on anything. I think from the U.S. perspective, it would be much more useful if we just focused on bilateral talks with China.
Okay.
Because China's now the biggest emitter of pollution in the world. We're the biggest emitter per capita. If those two countries would get together, then
Well,
I
that
think...
gets to a question.
Yeah.
The question always is, why should we do anything unilaterally, as you're suggesting, when China seems to show no willingness to do anything?
Well, first of all, I think China does show some willingness to do
Okay.
something. But the other
There were
point-
hints of that at Durban.
Yes. And they've certainly been investing so heavily in renewables. That's one of the things where the U.S. has really missed out. We're developing technology,
Fair
they're
point.
manufacturing wind turbines. But the other side of it is this. Ultimately, what we have to answer to is the physics of what's happening with the climate. And the best scientists in the world are telling us, you're running out of time. So I think there's some times where you have to simply say, we're going to take the lead on this. The world has looked to us for worldwide leadership for a long time. In some places, we're kind of falling off in that. And I think this is probably the perfect example of us to say, yes, regarding the big issues, when things are important, we still take the lead.
Take the lead. Talk for just a minute while we wrap up about what you're doing in Milwaukee.
Yeah, so we're betting the ranch on a very interesting model. And the model we're betting the ranch on is that groups of regular citizens who are empowered to interact with their federal government, who are structured, who have disciplined, who have a support system, can actually create more influence in Washington, D.C. than the people who can write gigantic checks. So we're making a large bet here.
That's a big bet.
Yeah, it is a big bet.
Yeah, an interesting bet.
And an interesting bet. And the really interesting thing about it is, though, is when things are as big as this, and it looks so hard, it's always easier to watch the people you disagree with and then shake your fist at the people you don't agree with and say they're stupid and we're justified, and while the world blows up, at least we were on the right side.
Right.
That's the easy way to deal with it.
Right.
The people who form these groups take the harder approach and say, I'm putting myself on the hook to solve it. Who's going to solve it? I'm going to solve this. So it's a very, very interesting thing to work with people like that, who say, I want to get myself on the hook as far as I can and to speak as broadly as I can that I'm committed to solving this. So we do believe that it is possible to have a partnership with citizens and politicians where we can work things out in the face of huge amount of money being spent by particularly the oil companies have almost unlimited resources. So we're starting a chapter here in Milwaukee, and some people are coming up from Chicago also, so we're very excited about that work.
Well, good luck, and thanks, Mark Reynolds, for being with us.
Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much. Appreciate it.